You hear it everywhere, right? This pervasive narrative that AI is this unstoppable force hurtling us towards a future of incredible progress, mind-blowing efficiency, and ultimately a brighter, better world for everyone. It presented as this inevitable, almost magical wave of innovation that we just have to ride.
And it's a powerful story. It really is, precisely because the promises are so appealing. You know, solving complex global challenges, automating away to tedious parts of life, unlocking new frontiers in science and medicine. It's the vision plastered across headlines, dominating investor calls, driving conversations about, well, everything.
Absolutely. Everything from national competitiveness to like our own individual productivity.
Right.
But what if that shiny future isn't the whole story? What if instead of, brand new progress, AI is actually following a much older, maybe less appealing playbook?
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into a specific source that argues exactly that, a report called Artificial Power Landscape Report 2025.
And this report, it's important to note, isn't based on speculation about, say, AGI or some far-off potential. It's really grounded in the concrete reality of what AI systems are doing right now.
On the ground today.
Exactly. It pulls together insights and documented findings from a really broad coalition of experts, researchers, advocates, people who've been meticulously tracking the real-world impacts of these technologies for years.
So who are we talking about here?
Well, contributions from groups like the Athena Coalition, Public Citizen, Data and Society, the Tech Equity Collaborative, AI Now Open Markets Institute, many others. The list of contributors is pretty extensive, including, prominent voices who've been sounding the alarm on these issues for quite some time.
Okay, so this is analysis built on documented evidence and actual on-the-ground experience. And their mission with this report seems pretty clear.
Yeah, it's to provide a robust counter-narrative to the, let's face it, dominant hype.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack their central arguments, pull out the key evidence they're presenting, and truly try to understand why they argue the current path of AI development isn't necessarily leading towards that shared prosperity or universally better future.
Instead, they contend it's actively reinforcing existing power structures and, crucially, causing tangible harm today.
Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to understanding the critical perspective that often gets overshadowed by all the relentless optimism. Okay, let's unpack this.
So at its core, the report makes this fundamental claim. AI, particularly in how it's currently being developed and deployed at scale, it isn't some revolutionary new kind of progress. It's simply rehashing an old playbook.
An old playbook. What does that phrase really mean in this context? Like, what history are they pointing to?
Well, the report links it to these historical patterns where new technologies, often positioned as, neutral infrastructure or tools to mediate complex systems, are actually built on the extraction of expertise and value.
Extraction. So not innovation that benefits everyone.
Not necessarily, no. It's described as a process designed to capture value from individuals, from communities, even from the environment, leading ultimately to the further degradation of life for the most marginalized among us.
Wow. So it's not just about the cutting-edge generative AI models we hear so much about lately. The report sees this extractive pattern in earlier forms of automated decision-making too.
Absolutely. The report is really explicit about this. This pattern applies just as much to the precursors, the automated decision-making tech that's been quietly implemented over the last decade or more.
In areas like
banking, credit decisions, hiring, and HR processes, certainly in criminal justice systems. The report's point is that while the specific technical methods might change or the vendor selling the software might vary, the underlying industry incentives driving their adoption, things like cutting costs, increasing surveillance, centralizing control, and, crucially, their common failure modes, are remarkably consistent across time.
And the report backs this claim up with evidence. It's not just an assertion.
Oh, yeah. They cite over a decade of evidence showing a clear and consistent pattern. These systems, far from distributing power or making things fairer, actually concentrate power.
Concentrated where?
Well, that power gets consolidated among those who design and deploy the technology. So the corporations, the institutions, the governments implementing them.
And what about the people whose lives are being decided or managed by these systems? The ones, on the other side of the screen.
Those on the receiving end, as the report calls them, are left in a significantly worse position. They become, and I quote, more insecure, vulnerable, and unable to contest the determinations made by the smart machine.
So their ability to navigate institutions, access resources, even challenge a decision they think is wrong, that gets diminished.
That's the argument. They're subjected to decisions made by systems that are often, well, they're often invisible.
Right. The report points out how opaque these systems can be. The whole black box idea.
Exactly. They are frequently invisible to those judged by them and inscrutable even when they are visible and people are aware they're being assessed by an algorithm. It's hard to know what's happening. And the report poses a critical question right there. Knowing this, understanding the power imbalance and the opacity, why would society ever accept this bargain?
That's a good question.
And this is where the report really sharply contrasts the pervasive AI hype with the actual documented reality.
And the hype is certainly loud. I mean, the excitement over AI's potential, the whiz-bang demos of speculative future capabilities, the bold Davos proclamations about transforming entire industries, it's everywhere.
Totally. And the report argues that this focus, whether it's deliberate or just accidental and speculative potential, effectively obscures the sobering reality of what AI is already doing, both now and, over the past decade.
So we need to look at the track record, not just the promises.
Exactly. When you actually consult the record, as the report does, with pretty extensive documentation, particularly in its third chapter, you see the concrete ways AI is already materially reshaping our institutions and our daily lives.
And how is it reshaping them, according to this record they've compiled?
Well, it's reshaping them in ways that reportedly ratchet up inequality, render institutions opaque to those they are meant to serve, and concentrate power in the hands of the already powerful.
Okay.
The report's conclusion here is quite forceful. Despite all the talk of future benefits, they say, on the ground, the deployment of AI systems consistently makes everyday people's lives, material conditions, and access to opportunities worse, and the systems that incorporate them stronger.
Wow. That's a pretty damning assessment. A world away from the brighter future for everyone narrative we started with.
It really is.
So let's dive into some of the specific problems and harms the report documents. The things happening today, right now. What are some of the fundamental technical flaws they highlight?
Okay, so a major focus, especially with the rise of large language models, or LLMs, is the issue of hallucinations. The report calls this an intractable problem.
Intractable, meaning hard or impossible to fix.
Yeah, because they argue LLMs fundamentally rely on what it describes as randomly generated coordination to produce text. It's kind of built into how they work.
Hallucinations being when the AI just confidently makes stuff up, right? Presents fiction as fact.
Precisely. And this inherent tendency means humans are often left in the position of needing to fact-check the tech, verifying information generated by a system that was supposedly designed for efficiency or reliability.
Which kind of defeats the purpose sometimes.
Right. And the report references peer-reviewed research showing that in real-life contexts, AI systems, including these LLMs, fail profoundly at even basic tasks.
Can you give a specific example from the report, something concrete?
Sure. One stark example cited is OpenAI's Whisper. It's an audio transcription tool used in various settings, including medical consultations, apparently. It has been documented inventing entire passages of text during moments of silence.
Whoa, inventing medical information during silence. That's not just a minor error. That sounds potentially really dangerous.
It does.
Why does this happen? Is it just like poorly trained models or bad data? Can't they just feed it better information?
Well, the report explains that LLMs work by predicting the next word or token based on statistical patterns learned from enormous data sets, often scraped from the, unfiltered internet.
So garbage in, potentially garbage out.
To some extent, yes. Because this data contains falsehoods, inconsistencies, imprecise information, the models are inevitably going to generate inaccurate responses sometimes. But the report adds a really crucial point. LLMs are fundamentally non-deterministic.
Non-deterministic.
Meaning that even with theoretically perfect training data, the hallucination problem wouldn't necessarily be solved. It's described as being part of the design, almost a feature, not just a bug. They'll often play along with prompts that contain incorrect assumptions, which can easily lead them down a path of generating false information.
So the problem is deeper than just cleaning up the training data. The very nature of how they generate responses means they're always potentially capable of inventing things. It's inherent.
That's the report's argument, yes. And while techniques exist to reduce the rate of hallucinations, the report notes these methods are often computationally expensive.
Meaning costly to run.
Right. And they involve trade-offs, like making the model less versatile or able to generalize effectively trade-offs. AI companies often prioritize avoiding to maximize broad applicability and, minimize costs.
Okay, so hallucinations are a core persistent issue baked into the tech itself.
Mhm.
What about data security? The report talks about leakage. What's
Yeah.
that?
Leakage refers to the problem where information that was fed into a model during training can later be accessed or extracted. Basically, the models can memorize bits of their training data.
Memorize it, like verbatim.
Sometimes, yeah. And this sensitive information can then be extracted relatively simply, either accidentally or maliciously by an adversary. The report notes this could include highly sensitive stuff, personal health information, maybe even classified military data.
Okay, that's concerning. And are current security measures effective against this kind of leakage?
The report paints a pretty concerning picture here. It cites research in the field of adversarial machine learning, that's the field studying how to attack and defend AI systems.
Right.
According to this research, in the current landscape, attackers are winning against the defenders by a comfortable margin.
Attackers are winning.
Yeah. And traditional privacy-preserving techniques, things like differential privacy, which can be useful in other data analysis contexts, reportedly do not work effectively against the massive, diffuse data sets used to train these large off-the-shelf LLMs.
So these big general-purpose models are inherently vulnerable to data extraction.
That seems to be the report's conclusion based on the research cited. It makes companies building on these models potentially inherit significant data security risks.
So how does the industry respond to concerns about this memorization or leakage? Do they acknowledge it?
The report states that the industry tends to downplay this issue. For instance, OpenAI has reportedly described memorization as merely a rare failure of the learning process, suggesting it's an unusual accident rather than, an inherent vulnerability stemming from how the models are trained.
Kind of framing it as a glitch, not a fundamental design issue.
Pretty much. The report also points to a lack of traceability. It's often difficult to track the original human labor or specific data sources across the complex AI supply chain. This makes it harder to effectively combat these types of attacks or even hold specific parties accountable when leakage occurs.
Got it. So beyond leakage, are there other general security or resilience problems the report identifies with these systems?
Yes, the report mentions that these systems are prone to broader cybersecurity vulnerabilities, too. This includes things like web poisoning attacks.
Poisoning.
Yeah, where malicious data is deliberately injected into training sets to corrupt the model, and also new jailbreaking methods that can bypass safety filters, leading to the persistent unauthorized disclosure of sensitive training data and other restricted information.
Okay, so we've got inherent tendencies to invent facts, leak sensitive data, and general cybersecurity vulnerabilities. That sounds like a shaky foundation, especially when AI is being integrated into critical systems.
It does raise serious questions.
And the report also raises serious questions about the claims AI companies make about their system's capabilities. It specifically highlights junk science, particularly around emotion recognition.
Yes, this is a significant point of critique in the report. They state clearly that substantial scientific evidence demonstrates that AI systems cannot detect human emotion, period.
Cannot detect human emotion.
Yeah.
But companies claim they can.
Despite this scientific consensus, yes. Companies continue to make bold claims about their AI's ability to understand or react to human feelings.
And who is doing this, according to the report? Any big names?
Oh yeah, the report points to some of the biggest names. OpenAI's launch of GPT-4o, for example, reportedly emphasized its ability to interpret facial expressions and determine a user's emotional state via voice and vision.
I remember seeing demos of that.
Right. And more recently, OpenAI reportedly claimed the new GPT 4.5 model possesses improved emotional intelligence, with CEO Sam Altman apparently comparing the interaction to talking to a thoughtful person.
And others.
Amazon's Novasonic is also cited for claiming the ability to sense emotion.
But the actual science just doesn't support these claims. It's not possible with current tech.
Exactly. The science suggests that while AI might learn to correlate certain physiological cues or speech patterns with expressed emotion based on its training data.
Like someone frowning or raising their voice.
Right. But it cannot reliably or accurately determine a person's internal emotional state across diverse individuals and contexts. There's just too much nuance and variability, yet the claims are made regardless.
Is anyone pushing back on this besides reports like this? Like regulators?
Well, the report does note that regulatory bodies are starting to recognize these issues. The EU AI Act, for instance, is reportedly restricting the use of emotion recognition systems in sensitive areas like workplaces, precisely because of concerns about their validity and potential for misuse.
Okay, so it's not just the technical flaws themselves, it's also how the industry presents its capabilities, often seemingly way ahead of what the science or rigorous testing actually supports.
That's a key theme.
The report discusses this as the "in AI we trust" problem and talks about how industry tactics contribute to it.
Yes, the report argues that AI firms sometimes rely on truthiness, creating a veneer of truth without an underlying basis, in fact, to push for the rapid, often uncritical rollout of AI systems, even in highly sensitive domains where failures could have really serious consequences.
Truthiness, like sounding true even if it isn't rigorously proven. What are some specific tactics they identify for doing this?
A key tactic highlighted is the over-reliance on white papers, instead of publishing through the traditional, rigorous process of peer review.
So bypassing the scientific scrutiny.
Essentially, yeah. The report notes that many corporate AI labs now circulate work that looks academic on platforms like Arcsvive, which is a legitimate preprint server, but it bypasses the methodological scrutiny and critical feedback of external peer review.
And then what happens?
Well, claims made in these industry-produced papers are then often picked up and uncritically recirculated by the press, becoming part of the accepted narrative about what AI can do, even without proper independent validation.
So company marketing or internal research basically gets laundered into looking like cutting-edge scientific findings.
That's the concern raised by the report, yes. They give several examples. Microsoft's Sparks of AGI paper was used to suggest LLMs were showing signs of artificial general intelligence, helping to fuel that whole narrative, despite significant debate and skepticism within the AI research community about the claim's validity.
Right, I remember that paper generated a lot of buzz.
It did. Another example cited is NVIDIA reportedly conducting its own study claiming its AI bot outperformed nurses. That's a pretty clear example of self-conducted research being used for marketing purposes, raising obvious conflict of interest questions.
And this isn't just limited to the huge AI labs like Microsoft or NVIDIA.
No, the report suggests it's seen across the industry. It mentions companies like Salesforce, which sells AI agents. They reportedly published numerous press releases based on their own internal studies or customer surveys claiming things like high demand from students for AI agents, or significant reductions in healthcare paperwork thanks to AI.
But not peer-reviewed or independently verified.
The report points out that none of these claims were subjected to peer review, external publication, or any third-party verification. It's essentially marketing presented as data. Google is also mentioned for linking to a report by Pearson, an edtech company that sells AI tools, to suggest AI enhances student learning, again highlighting a clear potential conflict of interest.
Okay, so a consistent pattern of companies using non-rigorous, often self-serving research to promote their products and shape the narrative around AI's capabilities.
Yes, and the report argues this is compounded by just plain flawed methodologies in some machine learning research itself, even stuff that does get published.
What how?
They point to a widely cited 2020 paper claiming AI could diagnose COVID-19 from X-rays with high effectiveness. Sounds great, right?
Yeah, potentially very useful.
But later analysis, cited by the report, revealed the AI wasn't actually detecting COVID. It was picking up background artifacts in the images, things like the specific X-ray machines used or the way patients were positioned in certain hospitals that happened to have more COVID cases.
So it learned correlations that had nothing to do with the disease itself.
Exactly. Which made the AI medically useless for generalized diagnosis outside of the specific hospitals it was trained on. The report highlights this as a failure to demonstrate construct validity, basically. The research didn't prove the AI was measuring or diagnosing what it actually claimed to be.
These documented flaws, the questionable claims, the marketing hype, it all sounds particularly worrying when these systems are actually deployed in critical parts of our lives.
Absolutely.
And the report goes into detail on the impacts across various sectors. Let's start with workers and the workplace. How is AI affecting labor, according to this report?
The report argues that AI companies are embedding what they call productivity tools throughout the labor supply chain. But it suggests their primary function is often to optimize their bottom line, not necessarily improve work life for the employees.
How does that work?
Well, it requires making every aspect of work legible to AI systems, meaning trackable and measurable. The report contends this makes working life more routinized, surveilled, and hierarchical.
So instead of technology empowering workers, it's being used more to control and monitor them more closely, like digital Taylorism.
That's very much the report's central point regarding labor impacts. It states that instead of using technology to, say, protect workers from uncertainty or improve their conditions, AI companies are sometimes actively, quote, undermining hard-won labor protections, exploiting legal loopholes to avoid corporate accountability, and lobbying governments to support policies that prioritize corporate profits over fair and just treatment for workers.
Wow. How does this surveillance manifest day to day for workers on the ground?
The report describes AI being used to surveil and nickel-and-dime workers at every turn. This often involves tracking their movements, their task completion times down to the second, sometimes even their biometric data, instead of ensuring they get necessary breaks or time off or support. It's also reportedly used sometimes to maintain dangerous conditions by optimizing relentlessly for speed over safety. And it can contribute to cultures of fear and alienation by reducing human interaction and constantly increasing performance pressure.
So the productivity benefits touted, who are they really for?
The report argues that the productivity narrative is primarily a benefit that accrues to the companies and their shareholders, not necessarily the actual workers performing the labor.
Are there specific, well-documented examples of this kind of algorithmic management leading to actual harm?
Yes, algorithmic management techniques are a major focus. Amazon is cited extensively. They reportedly track warehouse workers down to the minute using AI systems.
I've heard stories about this.
The report mentions they reportedly fire workers who accumulate just 30 minutes of time-off task over 3 days in a single year. And this time-off task includes essential human functions like using the restroom or just pausing briefly to help a coworker find something.
30 minutes over 3 days. That level of surveillance seems incredibly punitive. What are the documented consequences of that pressure?
Well, the report references a Senate investigation that found Amazon's algorithmically driven productivity quotas led to significantly higher injury rates compared to both the industry average and non-Amazon warehouses. Amazon workers were reportedly almost twice as likely to be injured.
Twice as likely.
Yeah, and their allegations cited that the company manipulated safety data to present a more favorable picture than reality. The report describes work being gamified, with the AI set rates constantly increasing, never slowing down. This can lead to a cyclical approach, where workers who inevitably burn out or can't keep up are fired, only to potentially be rehired later at lower wages when demand picks up again.
A sort of churn and burn model enabled by the tech.
That's the picture painted.
And the data collected from these workers through all this surveillance, what happens to that?
The report describes this data starkly as captured capital. It's used by firms to train the very AI systems that could eventually automate away the jobs the workers are doing, or be used to further reduce wages and worsen conditions by optimizing processes even more ruthlessly.
So workers are essentially training their replacements?
Potentially, yes. And this data is also reportedly sometimes sold to data brokers.
Okay.
Because of this, the report advocates strongly for prioritizing data minimization, collecting as little worker data as absolutely necessary, and implementing structural constraints on workplace surveillance that go beyond simple consent mechanisms.
Why beyond consent?
Because consent in an employer-employee relationship, the report argues, is often not truly voluntary due to the inherent power imbalance. Workers may feel pressured to agree to surveillance they're uncomfortable with just to keep their jobs.
Right. Okay, moving beyond the direct impact on individual workers, the report also examines AI's role in eroding the social safety net. How does that connection work?
Well, they state that as governments increasingly integrate AI, often influenced and pushed by AI firms themselves, this aligns neatly with existing trends towards privatization and austerity measures.
So AI isn't just making government services more efficient, maybe. It's being used as a justification to cut them or farm them out.
That's the report's core contention here. They argue that the widespread adoption of AI in government agencies is often ushering in a policy agenda designed primarily to enrich private interests, rather than to provide robust, accessible public benefits for citizens. AI firms are actively pushing for this integration, often framed within an austerity mindset, which ultimately serves to restrict people's access to needed resources and support systems.
And the AI arms race narrative we touched on earlier, how does that play into this dynamic with government services?
The report suggests it does play a role. The framing of AI development as this crucial national arms race, often tied to global competitiveness and security.
Right, we need to beat China.
Exactly. That narrative is reportedly leveraged to convince governments to provide generous tax exemptions and other financial incentives to private AI companies, which further redirects public resources away from potentially funding public services directly.
Okay. What about education? The report also expresses significant concern about AI's impact in schools and universities.
Yeah, the report argues that the rapid push to integrate large-scale AI systems into schools threatens to undermine the purpose of education itself.
Undermine the purpose. How so?
Instead of supporting deep, meaningful learning, it's seen as trading the complex, often messy, time-consuming process of real education for a potentially misguided pursuit of superficial efficiency.
What's the core problem they see with how AI interacts with learning?
Well, the report points out a fundamental mismatch between what LLMs do and what genuine learning actually entails. LLMs are essentially pattern matching machines, right? They are very good at predicting the next word or token based on statistical likelihood from their training data.
Yeah.
But true learning, the report argues, citing educational scholars, is about things like finding divergence from the baseline, imagining alternatives, developing critical thinking skills, fostering the capacity to think well, read well, listen well, and look well. It's a much richer, more complex process.
And LLMs interfere with that.
The report contends that LLMs, by providing instant answers or mimicking human-like responses without real understanding, can short-circuit this essential learning process. They argue it risks breaching the entire educational contract between student, teacher, and the pursuit of knowledge.
Are there concrete examples of this playing out in schools already, according to the report?
Yes, several are highlighted. One is the Lockport City School District in New York. They used a $4 million grant to purchase a facial recognition system.
Facial recognition in schools, why?
The stated goal was to prevent school shootings. The system created a red list of individuals flagged by the AI. But the report notes this system essentially replaced the nuanced roles traditionally held by teachers and counselors, people who build relationships and understand context, with cameras that lacked any real proven capacity for prevention or accurate detection in that complex environment.
And was this done with community input?
Reportedly, the decision was made without consulting parents or teachers. While community organizing efforts eventually led to that specific system being defeated, the report warns that similar deployments persist elsewhere.
Okay, what else?
Another example involves online surveillance systems like GoGuardian, which apparently saw wide adoption during the pandemic.
I think I remember hearing about those. For remote learning.
Right. These systems were implemented often under the guise of preventing students self-harm or ensuring focus during remote learning. But they reportedly gave school administrators unfettered access to student devices, monitoring search history, accessing webcams, remotely closing tabs they deemed inappropriate.
That sounds incredibly invasive.
It does, and the report notes that GoGuardian itself claims to have thwarted thousands of self-harm attempts based on its own internal data, highlighting the reliance on vendor-provided, unaudited statistics to justify the surveillance.
So in both cases, AI is being presented as kind of quick technical fix, maybe instead of addressing the underlying needs of students or properly supporting educators on the ground.
Exactly. The report frames this as quick fix solutionism. Institutions might prioritize throwing money at corporate edtech, especially during crises like COVID, instead of implementing the harder, long-term structural interventions needed to genuinely support student well-being and academic success. And it also notes how this approach can undermine teacher agency and professional expertise.
Healthcare is another really critical sector mentioned in the report. How is AI impacting that space, according to their findings?
Well, the report highlights significant investments by hospitals in AI technologies. It cites Epic's sepsis model as a key example.
Epic being the big electronic medical records company.
Right. And this investment in AI is happening even while the healthcare sector faces these severe worker crises, widespread understaffing, burnout, low wages for essential frontline staff. You know the headlines.
Yeah, definitely. So Epic's sepsis model, what was the issue there specifically?
So Epic released this AI tool back in 2017. It was designed to predict the risk of sepsis in patients, which is a life-threatening condition. It was advertised with claims of around 80% accuracy.
Okay, sounds potentially very valuable if accurate.
Absolutely. And hundreds of hospitals reportedly implemented it quite rapidly, often without independent verification or robust regulatory oversight. The report even notes it was included in Epic's honor roll incentive program for hospitals using your systems, encouraging adoption.
But the reality was different from the marketing claims.
It seems so. External validation studies, which the report references, later found the model was actually quite inaccurate in practice. It apparently produced a very high rate of false alarms flagging patients who didn't have sepsis,
Which could lead to unnecessary tests or treatments, and alert fatigue for clinicians.
Exactly. And, maybe even more concerning, it also reportedly missed many actual sepsis cases, potentially delaying necessary life-saving treatment.
Oh. And why wasn't this caught earlier?
The report points out that its proprietary nature, Epic's corporate firewall, as they put it, shielded it from external scrutiny and independent validation before it was widely deployed. Hospitals relied on the vendor's claims.
So, hospitals adopted a critical patient care tool based largely on vendor marketing, with potentially serious consequences for patients, rather than maybe focusing resources on addressing fundamental staffing issues first.
That's the dynamic the report identifies and critiques. It contrasts this investment in unverified AI tools with the ongoing labor struggles. For example, it mentions Kaiser Permanente signing a major deal with Nabla, an AI transcription company.
For doctor's notes and things.
Presumably. They signed this deal reportedly during the largest healthcare workers' strike in U.S. history, a strike primarily focused on addressing issues like understaffing and low wages. The report argues these AI investments often benefit the tech companies more than they address the fundamental problems like lack of staff, inadequate PPE, or the underlying profit motives that can sometimes drive healthcare decisions.
It sounds like a similar pattern maybe to the one you mentioned briefly in agriculture earlier.
It is quite similar. The report points out that agriculture is one of the most dangerous industries. High injury rates, pesticide exposure, notoriously low wages, a legacy of racism, and historical exclusion from key labor laws. All this makes it really difficult to attract and retain workers.
Right.
So now, agri-tech startups are marketing AI-powered robots, like a thing called a stout cultivator, specifically as a solution to this labor shortage. The marketing explicitly talks about reducing reliance on costly and scarce manual labor.
Okay, so again, technology presented as the fix.
Right. But the report argues it doesn't address the root causes of the problem. The poor working conditions, the low pay, the lack of basic protections that make these jobs undesirable and hard to fill in the first place. It's tackling a symptom, perhaps, not the disease.
Let's turn to immigration enforcement. It's another area where the report documents significant harm from AI deployment. What's happening there?
The report details what it calls rapid AI integration across the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. This includes agencies like USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and CBP, Customs and Border Protection.
And the concern is?
This raises significant concerns about due process, privacy, and potential civil rights violations. Immigration processes inherently involve collecting and processing massive amounts of sensitive personal data, making them a prime target for extensive AI deployment.
How specifically are these AI tools being used within DHS, according to the report?
Well, USCIS, the agency handling legal immigration and asylum claims, is reportedly using predictive tools. One mention is called Asylum Text Analytics.
What does that do?
It's apparently used to automate parts of the decision-making process and detect potential fraud in asylum applications based on analyzing the text of the application. However, the report notes that studies have shown these tools can exhibit high rates of misclassification, particularly for non-native English speakers.
Misinterpreting their language or communication styles.
Potentially, yes, leading to the system flagging applications incorrectly.
And the consequences of being misclassified in an asylum application context are incredibly severe, right? We're talking life or death sometimes.
They are absolutely life-altering. Misclassification can directly lead to denial of asylum, which could mean deportation back to persecution, lifelong bans from entering the United States, and in some cases, even imprisonment for up to 10 years based on a fraud finding.
And do people subjected to these tools know it's happening? Can they challenge it?
The report highlights a profound lack of transparency for the individuals affected. They generally have no ability to opt out, no clear pathway to seek remedy or correction for potentially incorrect algorithmic decisions. And the report states there's little public evidence that the tool's accuracy or fairness has actually been improved despite these documented issues.
It sounds like AI is being used primarily to accelerate enforcement and speed up processes, potentially at the cost of accuracy and fundamental fairness.
The report certainly suggests that. It cites some pretty alarming language reportedly used by officials, such as the former acting IC director aspiring to run deportations like Amazon Prime for human beings.
Wow.
The focus described is using AI to free up bed space in detention facilities and fill up airplanes for rapid deportations, emphasizing speed and volume. DHS is also reportedly experimenting with facial recognition technology to track migrant children, potentially starting from infancy.
And the tools themselves that are being used, are they reliable or known to be free from bias?
Well, the report points to the use of some pretty problematic tools by law enforcement and immigration agencies, including things like Clearview AI.
The facial recognition company that scraped billions of photos.
That's the one. It was reportedly used to target Black Lives Matter protesters, raising huge civil liberties alarms. Other tools mentioned include Palantir and SoundThinking, which used to be ShotSpotter, the gunshot detection company.
So tools with known issues are being deployed in this high-stakes context.
Yes. And the report argues that AI in this context provides a kind of veneer of objectivity that can actually mask outright racism and xenophobia, as well as significant political pressure to restrict immigration numbers. The whole enforcement process becomes profoundly opaque.
Making it harder to hold anyone accountable.
Exactly. It severely hinders due process and the ability for individuals, or even their lawyers, to understand why a decision was made against them or how to effectively challenge it. The specific tools used are often only revealed through lawsuits or leaks, and the report states many are not even disclosed in the official DHS AI inventory. Crucially, their calibration methods, the specific training data used that's frequently unknown, hidden behind corporate secrecy or government claims.
Where does the data come from that feeds these enforcement systems? Is it just official government records?
The report notes they rely heavily on invasive surveillance. This includes screening individuals' social media posts, using facial recognition technology at various points of entry and interaction, and potentially incorporating vast amounts of personal data purchased from commercial data brokers like LexisNexis.
Okay, so pulling data from all sorts of places, often without people's knowledge or consent.
That's the implication.
Beyond the direct human impact in areas like labor or immigration, the report also forcefully addresses the environmental impact of AI's current trajectory. What's the connection there?
It argues quite strongly that the way AI is currently being pursued is fueling climate degradation.
Fueling it. How exactly does the AI boom contribute to climate problems?
The report links it directly to the industry's intense focus on scale at all costs. Building and training these massive AI models and then running them requires enormous amounts of energy and resources.
The computational power needed is huge.
Exactly. This makes the AI industry dependent on climate extraction and energy dominance. And this dependency, the report argues, is accelerated by deregulatory policy that is often designed to boost the AI industry policies that demand more energy, more infrastructure, more natural resources going into AI with fewer environmental restrictions or safeguards.
What about the narrative you sometimes hear that AI will actually help solve the climate crisis? Optimize energy grids or discover new materials.
The report frames this narrative largely as greenwashing.
Greenwashing.
Yeah, presenting a positive environmental spin that obscures the very real, very significant environmental harm that large-scale AI development and deployment is already causing right now. By focusing on AI as a potential future climate solution, the report argues, we risk losing a future where governments and companies prioritize immediate, tangible actions towards sustainability, environmental justice, and building actual green energy infrastructure today.
And a huge part of this current energy consumption comes from data centers, right? The physical infrastructure behind the cloud and AI.
Yeah, exactly. The report highlights the unprecedented boom in data center construction as a key driver of this massive energy demand and the associated environmental impact.
And it's not just energy, is it? What are the local impacts?
Well, communities located near these massive data center clusters reportedly face a range of issues. Air pollution from backup generators, significant strain on local water supplies, data centers use a lot of water for cooling, and constant noise pollution. The report notes that this environmental burden often falls with a disproportionate impact on Black and brown frontline communities who are more likely to live near industrial infrastructure.
And who ends up paying for the vast amounts of electricity and the grid upgrades needed to power these data centers? Is it the tech companies?
Often not directly, according to the report. It argues that a significant portion of the cost for building new power plants, upgrading transmission lines, expanding energy grids is frequently passed onto ordinary ratepayers through higher electricity bills.
So my energy bill goes up partly to subsidize the energy consumption of these huge, profitable tech companies.
That's the report's argument. It cites examples like recent electricity rate increases approved in Georgia and proposed fuel rate increases by Dominion Energy in Virginia, which hosts the world's largest cluster of data centers, sometimes called Data Center Alley. These increases are linked, at least in part, to the massive energy demands of new data centers.
How does that happen? Don't the companies pay for their own power?
The report states that big tech companies often secure preferential energy rates via opaque and exclusive deals with utility monopolies. This effectively shifts the costs of their enormous energy demands onto other customers, residential users, small businesses, despite these companies having the financial capacity to fund their own infrastructure upgrades.
And they lobby to keep it that way.
Reportedly, yes. The report details how big tech lobbies intensely against oversight, against transparency measures, against stricter sustainability requirements, and against fairer cost allocation rules for data centers. It cites failed legislative efforts in Virginia to increase oversight and challenges to a bill in Oregon aimed at similar goals.
And do these data centers actually bring the widespread economic benefits to local communities that are often promised when they're being built? Jobs and tax revenue.
The report suggests there is little proof they actually deliver on those promises in a significant long-term way. The evidence presented by the industry to justify tax breaks and incentives is described as speculative at best.
How so?
While they often blur the lines between temporary construction jobs and the relatively few permanent operational roles inside the data center, and the projections often fail to account for the negative economic impact of higher energy costs on existing local businesses, which can make the area less competitive. Plus, the report adds that local communities frequently lose billions of dollars in tax revenue over time due to the generous, long-term incentives and tax breaks offered to attract these data centers in the first place.
So the environmental and economic costs are often downloaded onto communities and regular ratepayers, while the profits and benefits flow primarily back to the large tech companies building and using the data centers.
That is very much the picture painted by the report. It's a significant externalization of costs.
Okay, let's also look at the market dynamics the report analyzes. There's this narrative of a booming AI space with lots of new startups, venture capital flowing in, but the report argues something different is happening.
Yeah, it argues that despite the appearance of new entrants, little tech, as they sometimes call it, big tech remains the most influential stakeholder and is actually using this moment to consolidate its power in the AI market.
Consolidate power? How is that happening if there's so much new investment and activity from smaller players?
The report suggests that as core AI models become increasingly commoditized, meaning they get cheaper and more efficient for companies to develop or access, maybe smaller, more specialized models emerge.
Right.
The real competitive advantage shifts. It benefits the firms that already possess massive ecosystem power. We're talking about the established giants, Microsoft, Google, Meta, Amazon.
Ecosystem power.
Yeah.
Meaning they control the underlying infrastructure, the distribution channels, the customer relationships.
Exactly. Control over dominant enterprise and consumer software platforms like Windows, Office, Android, iOS indirectly. Major distribution channels like app stores, search engines, social media feeds, and, crucially, the massive data center infrastructure needed to run AI at scale. That gives them a huge, almost insurmountable competitive edge.
Can you give an example of how that plays out?
Well, the report points out that when chipmaker NVIDIA's stock saw a downturn recently linked partly to the idea that maybe smaller, more efficient models would eventually need less of their super powerful, expensive chips, companies like Amazon, Meta, and Apple actually saw their stock rise. The report interprets this as the market recognizing that the long-term value capture might lie more with those who control the ecosystems where AI gets deployed, rather than just the chip makers or even the model developers themselves.
Interesting. So controlling the pipes and the platforms is key. How else does this ecosystem power translate to AI dominance for big tech?
The report notes Meta's huge advantage in leveraging its vast advertising ecosystem for generative AI applications. Google benefits immensely from integrating AI into its dominant enterprise products like Google Workspace, and its DeepMind research division is reportedly increasingly focused on product integration rather than just pure research.
Amazon and Microsoft.
Amazon, as the leading cloud provider through AWS, is incredibly well positioned. They host models for others. They've invested heavily in AI startups like Anthropic. They've created their own model marketplace offering AI as a service. They also test AI extensively on their existing platforms like Alexa and their e-commerce site, and they're developing their own custom AI chips like Inferentia and Trainium.
Right.
Microsoft, with its dominant position in enterprise software through Office and Windows, and its huge investment in OpenAI, benefits significantly by advising companies to integrate AI models with their own proprietary data and workflows using Microsoft's Azure cloud platform and tools.
So even if a startup develops a really powerful new AI model, big tech has the infrastructure, the existing customer base, and the integration points to deploy it and monetize it at scale much more effectively.
That's the dynamic the report describes. And they also heavily influence the funding lines. The report states that back in 2023, big tech companies collectively outspent venture capital firms in funding generative AI startups, capturing an estimated two-thirds of the total investment in that space.
Two-thirds.
Wow.
How does that affect the VC landscape?
Well, it has reportedly caused venture capital firms to kind of realign their strategies. They're increasingly focusing on funding startups, targeting customers with deeper pockets and clearer, faster revenue streams, think governments and defense contractors, rather than maybe more speculative consumer applications where the path to profit is less certain and big tech competition is fierce. Companies like Anduril, focused on defense tech, are mentioned as examples.
And for those smaller AI companies that do get funding, what is often their ultimate fate, according to the report? What's the exit strategy?
The report suggests that for many smaller tech companies where the long-term independent business model is still uncertain, the most direct path to a profitable exit is often acquisition by one of the big tech firms.
Getting bought out.
Right. The report specifically mentions acquihires, where a large company primarily acquires a smaller company for its talented employees and intellectual property rather than its ongoing business operations, as a method big tech uses frequently. This allows them to absorb talent and potentially promising technology, while sometimes evading the kind of traditional antitrust scrutiny that a larger merger might attract.
So the innovation ecosystem might actually be feeding consolidation rather than challenging it.
That's a key part of the report's argument about market concentration.
Another significant trend highlighted by the report is the increasing securitization of AI. What does that mean exactly?
Essentially, it means AI companies are aligning themselves more closely with military and national security interests, and conversely, governments are increasingly viewing AI development through a security and defense lens.
Why is this happening now? Is it just about chasing lucrative military contracts?
That's likely part of it, but the report links it to a broader strategic shift as well. It notes the Biden administration's increased focus on securitizing AI as part of its national strategy, framing it as crucial for geopolitical competition. But it's also driven by some pretty strong rhetoric from company leaders themselves.
Like who? Any examples?
Palantir CEO Alex Karp is cited as a prime example. The report quotes some really striking language from him from early 2025. He apparently framed his company's mission explicitly around supporting Western supremacy through technology.
How so?
He's quoted saying things like, "We are dedicating our company to the service of the West, and we're super proud of the role we play, especially in places we can't talk about. And even more bluntly, Palantir is here to disrupt, and when it's necessary, to scare our enemies and, on occasion, kill them."
Wow, scare our enemies and on occasion kill them. That's incredibly direct and aggressive language for a tech CEO.
It is, and the report suggests this kind of alignment isn't isolated, it's part of a broader trend.
In what way?
Well, OpenAI, for instance, reportedly deleted its explicit ban on using ChatGPT for military and warfare purposes from its usage policies not too long ago. They are also reportedly increasingly leveraging national security arguments, even in seemingly unrelated areas like advocating for expanding fair use under copyright law, arguing it's necessary for the U.S. to maintain leadership in AI development.
So security becomes a justification for other policy goals.
Potentially. In February 2025, Google also reportedly amended its AI ethics guidelines to permit its AI to be used for military weapons and surveillance applications. This was a reversal of a policy they put in place back in 2018 after significant employee protests over their involvement in the Pentagon's Project Maven drone AI program.
Right, I remember that controversy.
But Meta
also reportedly announced in November 2024 that its Llama family of large language models would be made available directly to the U.S. government for national security applications. So companies that might have previously tried to maintain some distance from direct military applications, maybe due to employee pressure or public image concerns, are now actively embracing that alignment.
That's the clear trend the report identifies. Even figures like Anthropic's CEO are cited for raising the threat of authoritarian governments achieving military dominance in AI as a primary justification for the U.S. needing to accelerate its own AI leadership, potentially overlooking other risks in the process.
And VCs are funding this too.
Yes, venture capital firms like Andreessen Horowitz have reportedly established specific investment practices, like their American Dynamism Fund, explicitly dedicated to supporting startups in strategically important sectors, including defense, aerospace, and public safety.
And this focus on national security and competition in AI isn't just a U.S. phenomenon, right?
Not at all. The report mentions that governments within the EU and individual member states like France and Germany are also pursuing their own sovereign AI initiatives.
Sovereign AI.
Yeah, meaning developing domestic AI capabilities to reduce dependence on foreign tech companies, particularly from the US and China. While sometimes framed around economic competitiveness, these efforts often have a very strong national security dimension. This includes projects like the EU's Invest AI program, plans for state-backed gigafactories to train large European AI models, and Germany's commitment to developing a sovereign tech stack and supporting the pan-European Eurostack movement.
So this increasing alignment with military and national security interests seems like another significant force shaping how AI is developed and prioritized globally, potentially overshadowing other important concerns like civil liberties, ethics, or the material harms we've been discussing.
The report certainly suggests that this strategic or competitive framing can easily push those other critical issues like civil rights implications, algorithmic bias, accountability, environmental impact, the potential for societal harm further down the list of priorities for both companies and governments. It changes the calculus.
Okay. Now, the report uses a very specific and quite timely case study to bring many of these concerns together in one place: the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE.
Yes, DOGE features prominently.
And the report presents DOGE not just as a government agency, but as a prime example of AI solutionism being weaponized.
Yeah.
That's strong language.
It is. The report positions DOGE not as a genuine effort to streamline government processes for the public good, but rather as, and I quote, a wholesale attack on the administrative state operating under the guise of efficiency.
An attack on the administrative state, meaning
Meaning an attempt to dismantle or fundamentally weaken the existing structures and functions of federal agencies. AI is described as being central to DOGE's stated goals of modernizing federal technology and maximizing government efficiency. But the report explicitly links this rhetoric to a broader political austerity agenda.
Okay, so what specific claims does DOGE make about what AI can actually do for government operations?
Well, DOGE officials have reportedly claimed that AI can perform a whole range of really complex tasks. Things like automatically identifying specific budget cuts within agency programs, detecting fraud and abuse in government benefits, automating critical government functions currently done by humans, and even determining if someone's federal job is mission critical or could potentially be eliminated and replaced by AI.
Those are some pretty significant claims about AI's capabilities in complex government work. But does the report find any tangible evidence that AI, as currently available or as implemented by DOGE, is actually capable of doing these things effectively or reliably?
This is a really critical point for the report. It states emphatically there is no tangible evidence that AI is capable of performing these highly complex, context-dependent tasks effectively, or at all in some cases.
No evidence.
The report argues that independent reporting has dismantled over and over again the notion that the DOGE teams and the specific technology they're reportedly using are actually up to the task. Furthermore, the report notes that DOGE's public language, just throwing around the term AI, contributes to a false narrative. It perpetuates the misleading idea that AI is some single, mature, coherent set of technologies that can reliably meet these complex social and administrative goals, which the report argues it simply isn't.
So the claims about AI's capability within DOGE are not supported by evidence, according to the report's analysis. If efficiency isn't the real goal, then what does the report argue is the actual purpose of DOGE? Why create it?
The report argues pretty bluntly that efficiency is purely a pretext. It is, in the report's words, a power grab by process.
A power grab by process.
Yeah, using AI solutionism, the idea that AI can magically solve complex problems as a kind of smokescreen to enable a radical restructuring of the federal government itself. The ultimate goal, the report contends, is to consolidate executive power and reshape the federal government according to a specific ideological agenda.
And whose agenda is that?
The report links this initiative directly to the ideological agenda of the Trump administration and its financial backers. It points out that some of these backers reportedly own or have significant stakes in the very tech companies that stand to benefit immensely from increased government adoption of AI systems and the broader push towards austerity and privatization that DOGE represents.
Okay, so a potential alignment of political goals and private financial interests. What are the documented consequences of this alleged power grab on actual federal services and the workers who provide them? What's happening on the ground?
The report warns that millions of Americans who rely on the federal government to access critical and life-saving services will feel the effects most immediately. Services could be denied, delayed, or inappropriately revoked due to poorly implemented, untested, or simply incapable AI systems being rushed into place.
Are there specific examples yet?
The report highlights DOGE's reported directive to cut the Social Security Administration SSA workforce by 12%. This has apparently already led to documented issues like the SSA website crashing more often, wait times exceeding 4 hours for phone assistance, and significant delays in application processing times for vital benefits like disability or retirement.
Delays at the SSA affect millions, especially vulnerable people. And the report mentions concerns about migrating their entire computer system.
Yes, that sounds potentially massive. The report points to current reporting suggesting DOGE is pushing to migrate the SSA's complex, decades-old COBOL-based computer systems to new infrastructure in a matter of months, not years. The report states this incredibly accelerated timeline is all but certain to lead to massive disruptions. For the over 65 million people who rely on Social Security benefits, many of whom are elderly, disabled, or low income and depend on those checks arriving reliably.
That sounds incredibly risky. What about the federal workforce itself? Are people losing jobs?
The report notes that tens of thousands of dedicated civil servants across various agencies like the VA, Veterans Affairs, HHS, Health and Human Services, and the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, have already reportedly lost their jobs under DOGE initiatives. Some were apparently told their roles could be easily replaced by AI.
But the report disagrees.
Strongly. The report pushes back hard on this, stating unequivocally, but they can't be replaced by AI. AI is not designed to administer the federal government, nor is it capable of doing so. These jobs require deep domain expertise, human judgment, empathy, complex problem-solving things. Current AI simply cannot replicate effectively, especially in nuanced public service roles.
And if these AI systems, which the report has shown, are prone to flaws, hallucinations, and failures, are implemented in these critical government functions and inevitably falter, what happens then?
The report argues that DOGE might be intentionally creating a perfect vacuum for private companies to swoop in and clean up the mess.
Yeah.
They position themselves as the only ones capable of fixing the chaos that was arguably created by the push for inappropriate AI implementation in the first place.
Creating a crisis to sell the solution.
That's the dynamic suggested. The report quotes Eric Salvaggio, who wrote, "By shifting government decisions to AI systems they must know are unsuitable, these tech elites avoid a political debate they would probably lose about cutting services. Instead, they create a nationwide IT crisis that they alone can fix." And it notes the CEO of Workday, a major cloud software company, has reportedly called DOGE a tremendous opportunity for his company to integrate its products deeper into the government sector.
So the strategy, according to the report's interpretation, might be to deliberately sow chaos, undermine faith in the administrative state by blaming it for inefficiency, and then bring in politically connected private companies under the guise of providing necessary IT solutions and modernization.
That is the dynamic the report strongly suggests is at play. It argues that DOGE's actions are actually making government less efficient and less technically capable in the short and long term. By dismissing experienced civil servants, shutting down critical internal digital service teams, creating widespread uncertainty and low morale, and generating wasted work hours as remaining employees try to navigate unclear directives or fix AI-induced problems, it's counterproductive to actual efficiency.
Good for some businesses.
The report puts it bluntly. Threatening workers' livelihoods and creating this instability is potentially fantastic for business, for the companies poised to step in and profit from the resulting contracts.
The report also raises extremely serious concerns about data access and potential conflicts of interest related to DOGE's operations. This sounds really significant.
It is. This is a major red flag highlighted by the report. DOGE has reportedly been granted unrestricted access to people's sensitive, private, and personally identifying data held across the federal government.
What kind of data are we talking about?
Deeply sensitive information. Individuals' credit histories, Social Security benefits data, detailed tax data from the IRS. DOGE staff also reportedly have access to private market data, things like information obtained from confidential investigations and enforcement actions conducted by regulatory agencies like the FTC or SEC.
And this kind of comprehensive, sensitive data is incredibly valuable, isn't it? Particularly to private companies developing and training large AI models.
Precisely. It's a potential goldmine, and the report cites specific allegations. It's careful to frame them as allegations based on reporting that DOGE's operations, which are reportedly motivated in part by Elon Musk.
Musk's involvement is noted.
Yes, the allegations suggest DOGE may be feeding sensitive government data gathered through its broad access to train AI models for his private company, xAI.
Whoa, that would be huge if true.
Huge. The report frames this as highlighting severe privacy and competition risks and points to what it calls a clear conflict of interest with regard to Musk's own involvement in spearheading a government initiative that could potentially be providing invaluable non-public government data to his own private AI business interests.
That's a massive accusation. And the report suggests there's resistance to connecting the dots between government AI deployment, the harm it might cause citizens, and this broader austerity agenda being pushed.
Yes, the report stresses the importance of making that connection explicitly. It argues that pushback against initiatives like DOGE needs to be linked to the larger pattern of using AI-enabled efficiency as a justification for dismantling social services and implementing austerity measures. And it explicitly notes that this agenda inevitably has a disproportionate impact on marginalized and vulnerable communities who rely most heavily on these government services.
So it's not just about tech, it's about policy and who bears the cost. The report also includes a local government example. My city in New York City as another case study of this dynamic, right? A sort of microcosm of DOGE.
Exactly. My city is presented as a local level parallel to the issues the report identifies with DOGE at the federal level. The report notes that millions of taxpayer dollars have been spent centralizing vast amounts of city data into the My City platform.
And the purpose, according to the report, isn't just better services.
The report argues the primary effect, if not intent, is to entrench corporate and policing power, rather than primarily benefiting ordinary citizens seeking services.
In the My City chatbot itself, the AI part, how is that performed?
Not well, according to the report. The My City chatbot, which uses Microsoft Azure AI, has reportedly provided false, sometimes criminal information to New Yorkers seeking help with city services or regulations.
Criminal information, like what?
The report gives the example of the chatbot incorrectly stating that it was legal for an employer to fire someone simply for filing a sexual harassment complaint, which is absolutely not true and potentially dangerous advice. It has also reportedly given incorrect legal advice on other matters like housing laws.
And has it been fixed?
Even after these issues were highlighted publicly, the chatbot reportedly still includes disclaimers warning users that it may provide inaccurate responses, which doesn't inspire confidence. And of course, this directly benefits Microsoft through the ongoing city contract for the AI service.
What about accountability when the chatbot gives harmful, incorrect information? Can the city figure out why it happened?
The report highlights significant accountability issues there, too. When the city apparently attempted to understand the training data used for the chatbot to identify the source of these errors, Microsoft reportedly claimed the data was proprietary to the vendor, effectively blocking scrutiny and preventing fixes.
So the vendor controls the black box and the city's response.
The report notes that the city itself reportedly punted responsibility back to the vendor when questioned about the chatbot's effectiveness and inaccuracies. Meanwhile, a state law called the One City Act reportedly facilitated this whole data centralization push by sidestepping existing privacy rules to allow easier data sharing across city agencies, raising broader privacy concerns independently of the chatbot's specific accuracy issues.
Okay, so similar to the critique of DOGE, the report views My City not primarily as a successful service improvement for residents, but potentially more as a means to centralize data access for governmental and potential corporate use, facilitate the privatization of government work, like answering queries, and further entrench corporate power, like Microsoft's.
That's a strong contention. They note over $100 million has reportedly been spent on My City with few benefits to show New Yorkers in terms of improved, reliable services.
Is anyone fighting back against this locally?
Yes, the report does mention the ongoing resistance efforts from groups like the Surveillance Resistance Lab and various community coalitions in New York City. They are actively fighting against My City, working to expose its flaws and injustices, and challenging the official narrative that it's simply about efficiency and convenience.
Okay, so given this comprehensive and frankly quite critical assessment of AI's current trajectory, the report doesn't just leave it there. It also lays out some pathways forward, focusing on how to potentially reclaim public power and change this course.
That's right. It doesn't just diagnose the problems, it tries to offer solutions.
What is the core message for how to move forward? How do we shift this dynamic away from the harms and power concentration they describe?
The report's fundamental call to action, really, is to reframe the entire AI issue. It argues we need to stop seeing it primarily as a technical or abstract futuristic problem. Instead, we must frame it fundamentally as a fight about power.
Power, meaning?
Meaning who has it, who benefits from it, and who is harmed by its concentration. It's about economic power, social power, political power.
So make it clear that this isn't just about cool new technology, but about the underlying economic and social power structures it's interacting with and often reinforcing.
Exactly. The report suggests targeting how the AI industry works against the interests of everyday people. It calls for connecting AI issues explicitly to broader movements for economic populism and against unchecked tech oligarchy.
And does it see opportunities for that now?
Yes, the report sees the existing pushback happening around things like DOGE, the resistance to the unchecked build-out of energy-intensive AI data centers in local communities, and the growing awareness and anger about exploitative algorithmic wages. It sees these as providing fertile ground for building this broader movement and fighting for a different kind of technological future, one not solely dictated by corporate interests.
Okay, so reframing the fight around power. What specific policy approaches does the report recommend within that framework? What should actually be done?
The report summarizes its policy recommendations under what it calls a zero-trust policy agenda for AI.
Zero trust. That sounds pretty strong.
It is. The pillars of this agenda include recognizing that time is of the essence, meaning we need to act now by vigorously enforcing the laws we already have on the books, consumer protection, anti-discrimination, labor laws, etc. Don't wait for new AI-specific laws that might take years.
Use existing tools first.
Right. And it stresses the need for bold, easily administrable, bright-line rules. Rules that are clear, unambiguous, and relatively easy for regulators to enforce and companies to understand. No loopholes.
Bright line rules suggesting clear prohibitions or requirements, things you just can't do.
Yes, exactly. Clear boundaries. And perhaps most importantly, the report advocates for a radical shift in the burden of proof.
Burden of proof. How so?
Instead of the public or regulators or injured parties having to prove that an AI system is harmful after the fact, which is incredibly difficult with opaque systems, the report argues that the companies developing and deploying the AI, including the end users like employers or government agencies, should be required to affirmatively prove that their systems work as claimed and are not harmful.
Prove it's safe and effective before deployment.
Yes, and this proof should be required at each phase of the AI system lifecycle, from the initial data collection and model training through the development and testing phases, and right up to the final deployment and ongoing operation. The onus should be on the creators and deployers to demonstrate safety and efficacy, not on the public to demonstrate harm.
That would be a major shift.
Yeah.
Are there examples of specific bright line restrictions the report proposes? Uses of AI that should just be banned outright?
Yes, the report lists several specific uses of AI that it argues should be outright prohibited through these clear, bright-line rules based on the evidence of harm or unreliability.
Such as?
Using AI for emotion detection, given the junk science critique we discussed earlier. Using AI for social scoring of individuals based on their behavior or predicted characteristics. Using AI for selling worker surveillance data collected on the job. Using AI to replace public school teachers entirely, as was attempted in Lockport. Using AI to generate specific types of harmful deepfakes, like non-consensual sexually explicit imagery or election-related disinformation designed to deceive voters. Or using AI to automatically deny health insurance claims without meaningful human review.
So, identifying specific high-risk applications where the potential for harm outweighs any claimed benefit and just saying no.
That's the idea behind bright line rules. And this regulation needs to cover the entire process, right? Not just the final AI product that the consumer interacts with.
Absolutely. The report strongly emphasizes regulating throughout the entire AI lifecycle, from the initial massive data collection and training stages through the development of the foundation models and specific applications built on top of them, all the way to the final deployment and ongoing use by companies or government agencies. No free passes for different parts of the supply chain.
Right. It argues against allowing broad exemptions for the providers of the big foundation models, or for the application developers who build on those models, or for the end users who deploy the systems in critical contexts like hiring or loan applications. Everyone in the chain needs accountability.
What about transparency? Isn't that often proposed as a solution?
The report acknowledges transparency is necessary, but argues it's never enough on its own. particularly because the industry, they say, fiercely resists even baseline disclosure requirements. People need to know when AI is being used to make decisions about them.
And companies don't want to reveal that.
The report points to the pushback against mandatory proactive transparency requirements, where companies have to tell you upfront. In Colorado's recent AI law, as an example, industry prefers disclosure only upon request, if at all. The reality is, people affected by AI systems are often completely unaware that AI is being used behind the scenes.
So transparency is necessary but insufficient. What about relying on companies to regulate themselves or make voluntary commitments, like those pledges to the White House?
The report is unequivocal on this point. Companies cannot be trusted with self-evaluation. Voluntary commitments, such as those made by leading AI companies to the Biden administration, are deemed inadequate.
Why inadequate?
Because they generally lack strong enforcement mechanisms, and they don't fundamentally challenge the power dynamics or business models driving the problematic deployments. They're seen as largely performative.
So real enforcement is needed. By who?
The report stresses that government enforcement agencies, existing ones like the FTC, CFTB, EEOC, DOJ, HHS, need significantly more resources and in-house staffing. They need people with deep technical and domain expertise, like understanding healthcare or finance, to effectively detect, investigate, and remediate violations across the entire AI lifecycle. It notes that currently only a few agencies are known to have even limited teams with this combined capability, and in some cases, that capacity has actually been reduced recently.
So we need regulators with teeth and expertise. Going back to data centers for a moment, the report also calls for rigorous oversight specifically in that area, right? Beyond just the AI models themselves.
Yes, it reiterates the need to reject the current model of unchecked data center growth, particularly given the environmental and resource constraints we discussed. It advocates for local and state governments to reject any data center proposals that don't meet strict standards for environmental protection, resource use, sustainable jobs, and health impacts on the surrounding communities. Basically, make them prove they won't cause undue harm.
And worker privacy, which was a big theme in the critique of algorithmic management. How should that be addressed?
The report suggests reframing worker privacy not just as an individual right, but as core to the economic justice agenda around AI. It calls for strong data minimization rules that strictly limit what worker data can be collected and how it can be used, especially prohibiting the use of worker data collected on the job to train technology designed to displace those same workers or reduce their wages.
So stopping workers from training their own replacements.
Essentially. And it emphasizes the need for structural and absolute constraints on workplace surveillance rules that limit surveillance itself, not just relying on workers providing consent, which, as mentioned, is often not truly voluntary in an employment relationship. This also connects back to addressing the broader privacy and competition risks posed by big tech's existing data advantage and the potential for inappropriate access to sensitive government data, as raised in the DOGE case study.
Okay. Finally, the report talks about reclaiming public-centered innovation. What does that mean? Is it about government building AI?
It's more about presenting a positive vision for technological development that moves beyond the current paradigm, which is so heavily driven by large corporate AI interests and venture capital funding focused on quick profits. The report notes there's growing momentum for innovation guided by non-market imperatives, focusing on actual societal needs, public good, equity, sustainability, rather than just profit maximization or military applications.
So what would that look like in practice?
It includes exploring ideas for public options, government-provided services or infrastructure to compete with private industry and ensure baseline access and quality. Think public broadband, maybe public cloud infrastructure, or even publicly developed AI tools for specific public interest uses. Or it could involve public-private arrangements where the public good is explicitly prioritized and guaranteed in contracts with private vendors.
So distinguishing this public AI vision from what the report calls sovereign AI.
Yes, it draws a distinction there. While some governments are pursuing sovereign AI primarily for national security or economic competitiveness reasons, which often still involves partnerships with large private companies.
Right, like we discussed earlier.
A public AI vision, as framed in the report, would be centered squarely on serving the common good, ensuring equitable access to essential services, protecting rights, prioritizing human well-being, and environmental sustainability. The report argues that fundamentally rejecting the current large-scale, commercially driven, often extractive AI paradigm is a necessary first step to challenge the power asymmetries it creates and to actually build a different, more just technological future.
Wow. Okay. This report, Artificial Power Landscape Report 2025, certainly provides a really powerful, extensively documented, evidence-backed counter-narrative to the widespread AI hype we started with.
It really does.
It makes a compelling case, based on their analysis, that the current trajectory isn't automatically leading to shared prosperity, but is, in many documented instances, actively concentrating power and causing tangible harms across society. We've seen examples impacting everything from critical infrastructure like healthcare and immigration to everyday life for workers and students, and even potentially reshaping the government itself through initiatives like DOGE.
It really forces us, I think, to look beyond the dazzling demos and the futuristic promises and confront the sobering reality of AI's present and its recent past. The report argues that many of the problems we've discussed aren't just temporary bugs to be ironed out, but are potentially inherent features of systems built on extraction, opacity, and the pursuit of scale at all costs.
And that industry tactics often work to obscure this reality.
Right, and crucially, it doesn't just complain. It lays out a potential path forward that frames AI primarily as a political issue about power, requiring bold regulatory action using existing laws, creating new bright-line rules, shifting the burden of proof across the entire life cycle of the technology.
So, truly being well-informed about AI means grappling with these critical perspectives, understanding the evidence of documented harm, and recognizing that the current path, dominated by corporate interests, isn't the only possible future. It's not just about the potential benefits down the road, it's about understanding the actual costs being paid now and the power dynamics shaping this technology today.
Exactly. And the report's core message seems to be that changing this trajectory isn't going to happen automatically. It requires deliberate collective action to reassert public power and public interest in areas that corporate actors have sought to dominate and define according to their own agendas.
Which leaves us with a powerful thought to consider, drawn directly from the report's central argument. The report contends that AI companies have strategically positioned themselves to fundamentally reshape broad swaths of society in their interest, often against the public's interest. Thinking about everything we've unpacked today, from the workplace to the environment, from healthcare to government itself, what stands out to you, our listener, as the most crucial area where public power needs to be reasserted right now if we want to change this course? Where is the fight most urgent?